Welcome to the SheClicks webinar about camera selection. I'm Angela Nicholson and I'm the founder of SheClicks. So as I said, this webinar is all about selecting the right camera for you and your photography. And it's really important to remember that we're talking about you and your photography, because what might be the right camera for one person may not be the right camera for you. Your best friend may have a completely different set of criteria for assessing a camera, and therefore you need to think really carefully about what you want from a camera for your photography. But before we get going, we have a word from our sponsor. This webinar is sponsored by MPB, the world's largest platform for used photography and videography kit. MPB has transformed the way people buy, sell and trade equipment, making photography more accessible, affordable and sustainable. MPB is proud to partner with SheClicks to help support women photographers and their work. So thank you very much to MPB. They've been extremely supportive. So let's take a look at what we're going to cover tonight. Well, first off, I'm going to talk about some key decisions that you need to make when you're deciding what type of camera you want. Then I'll recap some of the different camera types. We'll also look at some features that you might want to look out for, and then we'll go to Q&A. Now let's take a quick look at the key decisions that you need to make. So one of the first decisions you need to make is whether you want to go for a fixed lens or an interchangeable lens camera. Now, some people can be a bit alarmed at the thought of an interchangeable lens camera because it's a whole new level of complication, and that's fine. Perhaps a fixed lens camera is the right one for you, and there are all sorts of reasons why that could be a good choice. You also need to think about the size of the sensor in your camera, and that's particularly important because actually larger sensors are more expensive, and there's some implications to both large and small sensors. So it's important to decide some of the key criteria that you want in your camera. Another thing to consider is the resolution or pixel count that you want your camera to have. And then, do you want a viewfinder? And if you do want a viewfinder, do you want that viewfinder to be electronic or optical? Now, personally, I think a viewfinder is a really defining feature that separates a camera from a smartphone. And whilst there are cameras without viewfinders, I would always generally opt for one with a viewfinder, but you might have a valid reason why you don't want a viewfinder. And then you need to think about what type of photography you want and what you want to get involved with and what you actually enjoy shooting. For example, if you're really into sport, or you think you would like to start photographing sport, or maybe you've got a dog that's always running around, you want to get lots of photos of him or her, then perhaps something like fast frame rates and autofocus, a really good autofocus system, is important to you. But if you're actually thinking of a camera that you want to take out on long walks, you want to you want to take some landscape photographs, then perhaps you don't need to worry so much about the autofocus system, but you need to make sure that you've got a camera that firstly is light enough for you to carry where you want to take it, but also that it's going to get that detail that you want to capture, and it's going to deliver exactly what you want. But I think one of the most important things about a camera is that when you pick it up, it excites you and you want to take photographs. And even before you pick it up, you want to go and pick it up. And it becomes something that you enjoy using. So it's really important that you think about some of the criteria that I've mentioned. Now, you need to think about, as I said before, fixed or interchangeable lens cameras. If we're talking about a fixed lens, then we're talking about a compact camera or a bridge camera. These cameras, you don't remove the lens, they stay on the whole time. So that's a fixed lens. And then if you want an interchangeable lens camera, we're talking about DSLR or mirrorless cameras. Now, a fixed lens can be convenient because you don't need to worry about taking anything else out with you. You've got all your lenses. It's just one camera and one lens. It's there. You get to know it. You know what you can do with that camera and lens, and off you go. You also don't have to worry about things like if dust gets in your camera when you take the lens off. That can be a concern with an interchangeable lens camera. You take you've got to be careful about the sort of situation in which you take the lens off. However, an interchangeable lens camera, you can get lenses to suit all sorts of different types of photography. You can start out with quite a basic lens, but then you can get more advanced lenses, you get longer lenses, you get lenses especially for macro photography, you get wide angle lenses and long telephotos. So you can pick the lenses that suit your style of photography. Next consideration, I think, is very important, is sensor size. And because the sensor is often the most expensive part of a camera, it's really important to think about what sensor size you want. And obviously, as the sensor gets bigger, it's harder to make, and therefore it's more expensive. So it makes the camera much more expensive. Now, sometimes we see terms like 1-inch type sensors, and it can be a little bit misleading. That term, you sort of think, oh, that sensor's about an inch in diagonal, but actually it's not. These sensors are more like sort of 13.2 or 8.8 millimeters. And it's because it uses an old measurement system that's kind of a bit outdated. So just be aware that, you know, if you're talking about a 1-inch sensor, it's not necessary. It's not a 1-inch sensor as such. And then there are smaller sensors as well, like 1/2.3 inches. And that is a really tiny sensor. We're talking about 6.3 millimeters by 4.7. So that is really quite small, sort of maybe the size of your little fingernail. Next size up that we commonly see in photography is 4/3 type, and that is usually a 17.3 by 13 millimeters. And you will see those in Olympus cameras and Panasonic cameras. Next up, APS-C format cameras. Now, these are used by Canon, Fujifilm, Nikon, Pentax, and Sony. And as you can see, they're a bit bigger than 4/3 type. They're 23 by 15 millimeters roughly, but there is a little bit of variation between the brands. Not a huge variation, but it has a little tiny impact that I'll explain later. And then there's full frame cameras or full frame sensors. And these have a sensor which is 36 by 24 millimeters. Now, if that sounds familiar, it's because it's the same size as a piece of 35 millimeter film. And because 35 millimeter film was such a big thing in photography, we tend to relate to it quite a lot. And we often refer to it when we're talking about lenses, and it just becomes quite a reference point. So even if you use an APS-C format camera or a micro four thirds camera, you may find yourself sometimes referencing full frame cameras when you talk about lenses. And I'll go into that a little bit more later. There's also something called medium format sensors or medium format cameras. And again, this is something which comes from film photography. And basically, they are a format of camera which has a sensor which is even bigger than a full frame sensor. And whilst the medium format sensors aren't quite as big as they were as a medium format piece of film was, they are still nevertheless pretty substantial. And we're talking sort of over 43 millimeters, almost 44, and 32.9 millimeters. So pretty big. And they were used in sort of Fujifilm GFX cameras and some Hasselblads, and indeed Pentax has one as well. Now, one of the things to bear in mind is that larger sensors require larger lenses, and that's because when the light comes out of the lens, exits into the camera, it needs to cover a larger area, and you have to, in order to achieve that, you have a larger lens. And sometimes, you know, people might think, oh, well, I want to get the best quality results I can, so therefore I'm going to go for a full frame camera. But then they realize that actually that means that they're going to have bigger lenses. And if you look at the difference between sort of micro four thirds, APS-C format, full frame, and medium format lenses, you'll see that they do get bigger and heavier. A larger sensor also enables you to restrict depth of field more. Now, that can be really useful for something like a portrait, where you might want to, you know, you frame a person and you want to blur the background. You can limit the depth of field and you'll get more blur at any given aperture with a larger sensor with the same framing than you will with a smaller sensor. Conversely, though, with landscapes, of course, you get more depth of field with a smaller sensor. So it can be a bonus to have a smaller sensor when you're doing that type of photography, when you want lots of depth of field. If you're using a larger sensor for landscape photography or macro photography, you just have to be very careful with, firstly, your aperture selection, but also where you put the point of focus so that you get the maximum depth of field or the maximum use of the depth of field that is created. You can also employ things like focus stacking, of course. Now, another point to consider is resolution or pixel count. Generally, the more pixels that an image has or is made up that captured by a camera or created by a camera, the more detail and the larger images or prints you can make. It makes sense. Say prints are usually at sort of 300 pixels per inch. So if you have more pixels, you have more inches at 300 pixels per inch. Fewer pixels, though, can be better in low light. And that I'm talking about if you have two sensors which are the same size. The one which has fewer pixels, those pixels will be larger, which means that they gather more light individually and they create a stronger image signal. That means that there's less gain that needs to be applied, less amplification. And as a result, there is less noise. So you tend to get a cleaner image, particularly when we're talking about high sensitivity or ISO settings, when images can start to get a bit noisier. So if you're thinking, well, this is where you need to think about how you're going to shoot, because if you're going to shoot, for example, if you're into music photography, so you're shooting a lot of gigs at night, then you might want to have a slightly lower resolution camera, because obviously you're going to be shooting in a lot of low light conditions and you want to be able to have nice clean images. Whereas if your primary concern is to get lots of detail, maybe it's landscape, maybe it's still life or macro, then maybe you want to have more pixels. You might want to have a higher resolution camera. And particularly, if you know that you say you're going to use a tripod, so you don't need to worry about the shutter speed, for example. You can have longer exposures, so you can use lower ISO settings, then perhaps more pixels is the way to go. But it's the important consideration. The important consideration is actually pixel density. And that's why I mentioned that if you have sensors of the same size, because if you have a large sensor which has got a lot of pixels, and then you have a smaller sensor which has got slightly fewer pixels, then it might still be, because you've got this bigger area, that the pixel density, that's the size of those pixels, or the density with which they're packed in, is actually the same. So it's just a question of thinking about the balance, really. Another important factor to consider is that more pixels means bigger file sizes. And that has implications for things like memory card storage purchase, how many memory cards you need, how big a capacity they need to be. But also things like, storing your images on your computer. Do you need more hard drive space? And also, if your computer is getting on a bit and you're finding it struggling a little when you're processing images, perhaps things are taking a little while, then if you go out and get a camera which has got a much greater resolution than the one you've been using, you'll find that it will get a lot worse because you're processing much bigger files. So it's something to think about. Now, I asked a while ago, it was on Twitter actually, about what people liked in terms of resolution. And if you look at what the popular resolution figures are for cameras, 24 million pixels seems to hit about the sweet spot, because you've got a nice blend of, it's a good size image, but the file isn't too big. You get a nice level of detail. Noise is relatively easy to control. So it's just a nice balance. But as processors evolve and cameras improve, we're still sort of seeing that creep up a little bit now. And we're sort of starting to see more sort of 30 million pixel cameras being kind of that middle ground. But we still think of 50 million pixel and 60 million pixel cameras as being high resolution cameras. So now let's take a look at lenses, because that's an important consideration in the whole scheme of things. Because when you buy a camera, it either comes with a lens or you have to get a lens to go with it. So the first thing is you need to think about the lens mount. Now, this isn't an issue if you're going to buy a compact camera or a bridge camera, because it's fixed. You don't need to worry about it. But if you're buying an interchangeable lens camera, either a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, you need to take it into account, because you need to make sure that you buy the right lens to fit on your camera. Now, each manufacturer, well, with the exception actually of Panasonic and Olympus, because they both use the micro four thirds mounts. But the other manufacturers have their own mount. So Canon's got its own mount, Nikon's got its own mount, and they also have different mounts for different types of cameras. Now, if we look at Nikon, for example, its mirrorless cameras, they use the Z mount. It's DSLRs, they have the Nikon F mount, and you can't use those lenses interchangeably directly. You can get an adapter, so you can put a Nikon F mount lens on a Z mount camera, but you can't just stick it on. You have to have the right mount. Nikon and Sony are pretty useful in, or pretty helpful in the fact that when you buy a lens, you buy it for the sensor size. So if you buy a full frame camera, you need a lens which can cover the full frame sensor. So you buy a full frame lens. Sony, and then if you buy an APS-C format camera, Sony and Nikon will actually allow you to put a full frame camera full frame lens on that camera, and so will Canon. However, Sony and Nikon will let you put an APS-C format lens on a full frame camera, whereas Canon won't. Now, because an APS-C format lens only covers the smaller sensor, the Sony and Nikon cameras will automatically crop down to that smaller area. So you will get a smaller image, whereas with Canon, you can't actually physically do it. So it's important when you're looking at buying the lens that you get exactly the right mount and you look for the right coverage as well. Now, if you're buying an APS-C format camera and you think that you may upgrade fairly soon to a full frame camera, then it might make sense for you to buy full frame lenses. But bear in mind that you are sort of buying more lens than you really need. And if you buy an APS-C format camera and APS-C format lenses, you'll have a smaller and more compact system, a lighter weight system overall. However, if you're buying a full frame camera, then really it makes sense to buy full frame lenses. Now, there's such thing as focal length magnification, and it kind of, when I mentioned before that we reference full frame and 35mm film quite a lot, this was really what I was talking about. When we have a camera, we sort of when we have a lens, we envisage the kind of framing that we're going to get, the sort of what we'll be able to fit in the image. So with a full frame camera, if you imagine you have a 100mm lens, it has a 1x focal length magnification. So basically you put that 100mm lens on and you get the framing that we expect from a 100mm lens. If you put that same 100mm lens on an APS-C format camera, because the sensor is smaller, the image you get is kind of cropped in. It's smaller than you would get from the full frame camera. And with Nikon cameras and Sony cameras, that focal length magnification, that cropping in, it's like zooming in 1.5 times. So your 100mm lens looks like a 150mm lens. So if you put your 100mm lens on your APS-C format camera and you put a 150mm lens on a full frame camera, you'd get the same framing. Now, I mentioned there's a little difference between the APS-C sizes, and that's why with Canon, you actually get a 1.6 focal length magnification. So it's about, the lens looks a bit like it's 160mm long. With micro four thirds cameras, you get a 2x focal length magnification. So your 100mm lens will look like a 200mm lens. Now, that's not so great if you're interested in wide angle photography, although there are lots of wide angle lenses with the micro four thirds mount now. But if you're into wildlife photography, then it is a huge advantage because you could have a 300mm lens, and on a micro four thirds camera, it will give you the framing that you get on a full frame camera using a 600mm lens. And if you can imagine, a 600mm lens on a full frame camera is a big thing, it's heavy and it's expensive. Whereas a micro four thirds 300mm lens is quite a bit smaller, it's usually more affordable, and it's probably not as heavy. Just thinking about, sort of when you buy a first camera or interchangeable lens camera, you usually buy some sort of kit lens with it, or a standard lens is a good starting point. And with a micro four thirds camera, you're often looking at something around the 14 to 42 zoom range. So that would be equivalent to 28 to 84mm. So that's giving you something quite wide. It's good for landscapes, and then something a bit longer that's going to be good for portraits and picking out a few details. On APS-C, 18 to 55 is typical as a sort of first lens to go with that kind of camera. But again, there's all sorts of different variations. People don't necessarily go for that. And then on full frame, a 24-70 is a very popular focal length, but you might see things like 24-105, just a little bit longer, all sorts of variations, but those are good starting points. You may have seen with lenses, sometimes people talk about the zoom range. And this is basically a way of kind of giving people an idea of how far you can zoom when you've got, you start at the wide point and how far you can go into the image when you zoom. And it's basically the telephoto end divided by the wide angle length. So with this example here, we've got a 25 to 400 millimeter focal length range, which is a very wide range. It's not your typical sort of takeaway lens. This is a sort of lens you might get on a bridge camera, and that's a 16 times zoom. Now let's take a look at some features of compact cameras. They're generally small. They're considered convenient and portable, but you can get, obviously there's a range of sizes, but the point of a compact camera for many people is that they are small and portable. These days, although you can get some point and shoots, there are plenty of compact cameras that go way beyond that, and you get, you can have aperture priority, you can have shutter priority, you can have manual control. It's not just a point and shoot. They also use a variety of sensor sizes. Now, we tend to think of them having small sensors, and some do have sensors as small as 1/2.3, but they also go all the way up to full frame. Now, as I mentioned before, sensor size is a key part of the cost of a camera. So a full frame compact camera is a lot more expensive than your average compact camera. They can also have either they always have a fixed lens, but it can be a prime lens, which means it's got a single focal length, you can't zoom, or it's a zoom lens. And there are pros and cons to both. I mean, we tend to go for zoom lenses more these days because they are more flexible. You can stand in one spot and zoom in, or you can zoom out, and you can do your composition by zooming in and out, and it's nice and convenient. Prime lenses, they've usually got a bigger maximum aperture, so they let more light in, which means you can use faster shutter speeds in low light. You can restrict depth of field more, but also they encourage you to move around the subject and explore it. So it can be better for your photography sometimes to go for a prime lens, even though it seems more limiting. They also come with and without viewfinders. And when we were sort of like going through the early transition phase from film to digital photography, a lot of compact cameras came out without viewfinders, but increasingly now they feature them. And sometimes you might see a compact camera and you think, well, it doesn't look like it's got a viewfinder, but there might be a pop-up unit. So it's worth exploring to check whether it's got a viewfinder. As I said before, I would always encourage you to get a camera with a viewfinder, because I think it's a really useful thing to have. If it's very bright light and you're looking at the screen, you probably know with your smartphone, you're looking at the screen, it can be really hard to see the image properly. You can't tell whether you've got it correctly exposed. You can't see if the subject's in focus, and sometimes you can't even see the composition very well. If you've got a viewfinder, you can block out all that ambient light and you get a good idea of what's going on. So I've just picked this as an example of a collection of features which I think are quite good for a compact camera to have. This is a good compact camera, but I'm not necessarily using these examples to say this is the one to get. So we have here, it's a 1-inch type sensor, and it's got 20.1 million pixels. And a 1-inch type sensor, although it's quite small, it's quite a good option for a compact camera, because it means the camera can be kept quite small. It's pocketable. You could probably, I don't think you might tuck this in your jeans pocket, but I think your back pocket, but you're more likely to put it in a jacket pocket or something like that. But it's a nice convenient size, very portable. It has the equivalent of a 24 to 120 millimeter lens, which is a great focal length range because you've got the width for landscapes, and then you've got the telephoto end for picking out details and doing capturing portraits and things like that. It's also a nice fast lens, so you've got f1.8 at the widest point, and you've got 2.8 at the telephoto end, which is really nice and fast for 120 millimeters. This camera also happens to have 20 frames per second shooting, which could be useful if you want to capture, fast action or things happening unexpectedly. It's got a tilting touch screen, which is a nice feature, and I really like tilting screens. I think they're very useful. And this is an example of a camera with a pop-up viewfinder. Now, that's actually the flash that's popped up. You can't actually see the viewfinder. It's collapsed down in this picture. I've also mentioned that it's got an exposure compensation dial, and the reason why I've mentioned that is because exposure compensation tends to be one of the features that you adjust on a shot-to-shot basis. So if you've got quick access to something like that, it's really handy. You know, you can just, it encourages you to kind of like get the image looking exactly as you want it at the shooting stage. Now, this is a slightly different camera because it's got an APS-C format sensor, so it's quite a big step up in terms of sensor size. It's also got a very highly regarded sensor. It's a 26.1 million pixel X-trans CMOS sensor, which is the same type of sensor as Fuji uses in its interchangeable lens cameras, and they produce some really lovely images, lots of detail, great colors. It's also got the equivalent of a 35mm lens, and it's an f2 aperture, which is nice and fast. 35mm is a really popular focal length for street photography, documentary photography. It's handy for portraits. You can use it for environmental portraiture as well. So it's a nice choice of lens. Unusually, this camera also has an electronic and an optical viewfinder, and you look through the same point, but there's a switch that you flick that sets it to either optical or electronic. So if you're unsure about electronic viewfinders, I mean, not everybody gets on with them, then maybe this could be a good camera for you because it's also got an optical one. Another feature I like about this camera is it's got traditional exposure controls. And what I mean by that is you can see that it's got an aperture ring around the lens. So you set the aperture using the ring. It's also got a shutter speed dial, and you set the ISO or sensitivity using a dial on top of the camera. And then also it's got an exposure compensation dial. And why I like that is because firstly, I find it very instinctive to adjust it. You're not looking at something in the viewfinder change, you actually physically change it, or it feels like you're physically changing something. But also, if you have the camera turned off, you can look down and you know how it's set. You can actually set the camera up, you know, for the shutter speed you want or the aperture you want to use without even turning it on. And then you turn it on and you're ready to go. So bridge cameras. A bridge camera is a hybrid camera that bridges the gap between an SLR and a compact camera. And they really came around or introduced really in the days of film photography. And they have a similar shape and control to an SLR, but they were like a compact camera because they had a fixed lens, and also they don't have a mirror. So we called them bridge cameras. These days, bridge cameras use a small sensor, and the reason for that is because it enables a large effective zoom range. And I mentioned before about focal length magnification factor. It's the sensor size that's involved there. So if you have a small sensor, you can have a huge zoom or a huge lens on your, or a huge focal length, I should say, on your camera. So, you know, something like 25 to 400 millimeters is quite feasible. You know, that's actually not particularly impressive in bridge camera terms, but actually, you know, a lot of people might have lenses that start at, say, 24 millimeters and go up to 200, or maybe they, and I mean by that, you know, if they've got interchangeable lenses, they've got a selection of lenses that cover that focal length range. They might go up to 300 millimeters, some might go up to 400 millimeters. But I don't know anybody who has got a 3000 millimeter lens, certainly carries it out and carries it around. And even if, you know, people who've got long lenses and teleconverters, they don't go up to 3000 millimeters. So the ability to have a 24 to 3000 millimeter lens is, you know, a fantastic thing. It's very unusual. If you had a 3000 millimeter lens for a full frame camera, I think we'd probably struggle to lift it. You know, it would be huge, it would be massively expensive, and it would be very impractical. But of course, you know, even on a bridge camera, there are a few things that you need to bear in mind with such a long focal length. For example, you know, it means that when you're at the longest focal length of that camera, tiny movements will make a huge difference to the framing of the image. So it can take a while to get the framing exactly as you want it. It can be a little bit frustrating. And also, you need, although many of them have some stabilization, you probably need to use a faster shutter speed than you might expect to freeze the subject, or to, you know, to freeze the camera shake. So you may need to use a monopod or a tripod, which to some people may negate the whole point of using a bridge camera, but it's something to bear in mind. However, if you're really into photographing the moon, or you're really interested in photographing owls that, you know, some distance away, then this is a really great, it could be a really great option. So as I say, the bridge cameras are really convenient and versatile because it's like having a whole bag of lenses in one camera. And all you need to do is charge your battery, pop your card in, off you go. You've got it with you. You can do pretty much anything you want. But what I would do is encourage you to think about what focal length you actually would use. Because if you know, in a whole year, take one shot at 3000 millimeters. If that's the image that makes you happiest than any other image in the world, then that's great. Don't worry about it. But if you find that the most of the time you're shooting in the 25 to 400 millimeter range on your camera, you're actually carrying around a bigger, heavier lens than you really need to. So this is what we might think of as a typical bridge camera. It's Panasonic FZ82. It has a small sensor. It's 1/2.3 inches, but Panasonic's being quite modest with its pixel count. It's 18 million pixels, which means that those pixels aren't jammed in there. They're a reasonable size, and it enables the camera, by having that small sensor, it enables the camera to have a fantastic focal length range of the equivalent of 20 to 1200 millimeters. Now, again, that's a huge range. And, I know a few people who might have a zoom lens that goes up to 600 millimeters. And if they get a two times teleconverter, they can take it up to that 1200, but it will be a lot bigger and heavier than on this camera. Now, I'm not saying you'll get exactly the same quality, because at the end of the day, you're using a camera with a smaller sensor, and the optics are slightly different, but it gives you the opportunity to frame those images. Something to bear in mind is that as you zoom from 20 to 1200, the aperture drops from, it starts, you can have a maximum aperture of 2.8, but at the longer end, it goes down to 5.9. So there is less light going into the lens, or exiting the lens, hitting the sensor. So that means you will have to adjust the exposure accordingly. But it's a nice sized camera. It's got a good grip. It's got a nice fusible lens, and it's very versatile. This is the Nikon Coolpix P1000, and again, it has a 1/2.3 inch sensor, and the pixel count is quite low at 16 million. But it's that combination. By keeping the pixel count low, it means that the noise level isn't too high in the mid-range sensitivity settings. And it enables a phenomenal zoom range of 125 times zoom, which takes you to the equivalent of 24 to 3000 millimeters. This is what I was mentioning earlier. The actual focal length is 4.3 millimeters to 539 millimeters. But because of the small sensor, the focal length magnification takes it to that phenomenal 24 to 3000 millimeters. And of course, unfortunately, there is some drop off in the aperture size. So whilst it starts at 2.8 at the widest end, it goes to f8 at the longest telephoto point, and that is quite a drop in brightness, or in the amount of light hitting the sensor. So it means you have to adjust either the shutter speed, you'll have to have longer exposures, or you need to push the sensitivity up, the ISO up. So you just need to factor that in. Also, because we're talking about a 500 millimeter lens is a substantial lens, even for a small sensor camera like this. So it is quite a heavy camera in sort of bridge camera terms. We're talking about 1.5 kilograms almost. So it is quite a heavy camera, but it could be the perfect combination for your type of photography and what you like to do. Now let's look at DSLR cameras, and DSLR stands for digital single lens reflex. They have a mirror inside which reflects light into the optical viewfinder. And this is the key distinguishing feature between a DSLR and a mirrorless camera. They come in APS-C format or full frame. They can act like a mirrorless camera in live view mode. So basically, when you switch the camera to live view mode, the mirror lifts up out of the way and you can see the live view image on the screen. Now, because they have an optical viewfinder, there's no screen in there. You can't see the live view image in the viewfinder, but you can see it on the screen on the back of the camera. Because they have two different sort of operations, modes of operation, they have two different focusing systems. So, and in fact, they have two different metering systems and two different white balance systems. And that's because, when the mirror is up, in live view mode, it's using the imaging sensor for the focusing and the metering and everything. But when the mirror is down and you're looking in the viewfinder, there is a dedicated autofocus sensor. So this is a section through a DSLR. Someone's cut a Nikon D5 in half, and you can see, you can see the elements of the lens going into the camera body. You see that black box at the center of the camera. There's a gray diagonal. That is the mirror. And so the light comes through the lens, it hits the mirror, and it reflects up into the viewfinder, where it pings around and comes out of the viewfinder the right way around and the right way up. When you're focusing, what happens is, when the camera is in this mode of operation, there are a few translucent areas on that mirror which allow a little bit of light through, which then hit the sub mirror, which you can see through behind it, or the secondary mirror, which reflects the light onto the dedicated autofocus sensor, and that enables the camera to focus. However, in live view mode, both mirrors have to lift up out of the way, and the light goes right the way through and it hits the sensor, the imaging sensor, and then the imaging sensor is used for the autofocus and metering. Now, obviously, with a mirrorless camera, if you imagine taking that mirror out, you've then effectively got, you don't need the autofocus unit at the bottom, or the autofocus sensor at the bottom. So suddenly you've got a space that you can move the lens closer to the sensor. And it's that sort of removal of the lens which enables mirrorless cameras to be made a bit smaller and a bit lighter. Also, because you don't need the mirror, and the pentaprism arrangement is different as well. You don't have a pentaprism, you have a digital screen in your viewfinder in a mirrorless camera. So it all gets slightly different. Now let's take a look at a typical introduction DSLR. This is Nikon D3500, and this has been a great camera, or this line of cameras have been great for a lot of new photographers. It has an APS-C format sensor, 24 million pixels, and it's a really good sensor that captures, a nice level of detail. It has Nikon's F mount, and there are a huge number of Nikon F lenses. It also has a really excellent guide mode, which helps you learn about photography using non-sort of photographic or techie terms. It really helps explain things, so you can take control over the camera as you learn more. It can also operate in live view mode, but it's worth knowing that this camera actually has a fixed screen and it uses a fairly slow contrast detection system. So it's not the best camera if you're planning on using it in live view mode. But nevertheless, it's pretty, although it's an entry-level camera, it's pretty solidly built. It's, it's a good introduction to DSLR photography. As an alternative, here is the Canon EOS 250D, and Canon, although it's got the same sort of size sensor, similar resolution, it's got Canon's EFS mount, which is the mount that is specifically designed for use on Canon's DSLRs with an APS-C format sensor. Now, you can put a full frame Canon lens on there, an EF mount lens on there, but you cannot put a Canon EFS mount lens onto a full frame Canon SLR. They won't mount because it would cause damage to the mirror. Canon got on board with the idea of live view quite quickly, and this camera has what we call a dual pixel CMOS AF system, and it basically means that it uses phase detection focusing in live view mode, and that is fast and effective. There's also a vari-angle screen, which is really useful because you can tip it to give you a view of the image that you're composing, either in landscape or portrait orientation. Now let's look at mirrorless cameras. So they're sometimes called compact system cameras. And the reason for that is because I sort of alluded to it earlier, basically, that because they've got no mirror, they are like a compact camera. But we call them system cameras because they accept interchangeable lenses and you build a system around them. And that when mirrorless cameras first came out, we were kind of like looking around for a word to describe them, because actually, compact cameras are mirrorless as well. Rangefinders are mirrorless. And for a while, we did sort of call them compact system cameras, but these days we seem to have pretty much settled on mirrorless cameras. And as I mentioned, there's no mirror, so the camera can be smaller than the DSLR because you've removed that thing, so you can move it a little bit closer. You can also sometimes make the lenses a bit smaller because they are closer to the sensor. And because there is no mirror, the light passes straight through the lens to the imaging sensor. Obviously, the shutter has that open, but it goes straight to the sensor, and it uses the sensor for autofocusing, white balance, and metering. And I'm talking about the imaging sensor here. They come with 4/3 type, so micro 4/3, APS-C format, full frame, or medium format sensors. They use one focus system, and that could be contrast or phase detection or a blend of the two, which is a hybrid system. So this is the Fujifilm X200, a nice entry-level mirrorless camera. It's got an APS-C format sensor, 24 million pixels, Fuji's X mount, and that means that you've got access to Fuji's really superb range of lenses, actually. And it's a hybrid AF system, so it uses contrast and phase detection. You've got a vari-angle screen. You can see there that it's sort of twisted, so giving you a view from a strange angle. And it's a touch screen, so really nice sort of solid camera to get started with. Alternatively, if you were looking for a full frame camera, then this is just this is an example of what we call an entry-level full frame camera. It's a Nikon Z5. It's 24.3 million pixels. It's got Nikon Z mount, which is actually really big. It's much bigger than the Nikon F mount. And the reason Nikon increased the size of the mount when it introduced the Z series, it was because it would enable the company's lens engineers to produce much more exotic optics and faster lenses. It has a hybrid AF system, hybrid autofocus system, so it uses phase detection and contrast detection. And it has a tilting touchscreen, which is really useful. It just makes, although you have all the buttons and dials that you'd expect, sometimes a touchscreen just makes a camera a little bit more intuitive or faster to use. Now let's have a look at some of the other features that you might want to look out for. So as I said, a viewfinder, I think a viewfinder is very important. Most cameras, most interchangeable lens cameras have them, many compact cameras have them, but there are a few mirrorless cameras that don't. So just keep an eye out for it. Make sure you decide whether you want one or you don't want one. As I've mentioned, fixed, tilting, or vari-angle screens. Now, if you're the sort of person who generally shoots everything at eye level, and that is your plan, whatever you're going to do, most of your photography is going to be eye level, then fine, go for a fixed screen. But if you I like to shoot quite a lot of images quite low down, and it makes a tilting screen really useful. However, a vari-angle screen is useful when you're shooting in portrait orientation at low level, because you can tip it. Sometimes you get dual tilting screens, it tilts in two different directions. So it's kind of like a tilting rather than a vari-angle mechanism, but the end result is it's useful in portrait and landscape orientation. So just something to think about. Obviously, if you go for a fixed screen, then it's usually going to save you a little bit of money, and they are generally considered more robust, but people always raise concerns about vari-angle screens not being as strong, or tilting screens not being as strong, but I don't know too many people who've had problems with that. Also think about the autofocus system, whether you want to have phase detection or contrast detection or a hybrid system. As I mentioned at the outset, if you're mainly interested in still life photography or landscapes, then you don't really need to worry about having the latest, fastest autofocus system. But if you're really interested in shooting sport, then maybe it's a more serious consideration for you. Stabilization can be really useful, and this might be in body, or it might be lens-based, or it can be in both. And basically enables you to shoot at shutter speeds lower than you would normally if without a stabilization system. It basically compensates for some of those little handshakes and moves that you make when you're hand holding a camera. Of course, what it can't do though is compensate for subject movement. So if you're photographing rugby, for example, and someone's running along, it doesn't really matter that your lens is stabilized, because you need to be able to use a shutter speed that will freeze them, unless you desperately want to blur them, of course. Cameras are usually constructed either from metal or polycarbonate, another word for plastic, and And metal is generally considered better because it's more robust. But you know, polycarbonate is it's a modern material that has developed over the years, and it can be very strong these days. It can also be very light. Sometimes manufacturers use what we call a monocoque construction, which means the whole of the camera is in one piece, which gives it an a certain amount of strength as a result of that. So, you know, you usually pay less for a polycarbonate camera, but and you usually pay a bit more for a metal one. Also think about the weatherproofing. If you're the sort of photographer, you know, if you want to be standing on the touchline photographing and carry on photographing when it starts to drizzle or chuck it down with rain, then you should look at getting a weatherproof camera, or make sure that you have some sort of covering for your camera to keep it safe. Manufacturers can be a bit cagey about the degree of weatherproofing of their camera, so it's worth investigating, you know, to see what people's opinions are on the weatherproofing. Sometimes, you know, it's just for the odd bit of drizzle, and if it's going to really rain, you need to get a cover. Also look at the memory card that the camera takes, because although they are often SD type, they're not always SD type, and there are some new ones becoming more prevalent. With the XQD sort of has come in, but also we've got CF Express, and sometimes those faster cards, these newer cards allow sort of more higher resolution video or faster frame rates and this kind of thing. So if it's really important to you to get the absolute maximum out of your camera, you might want to or have to invest in a different type of memory card. Also, you know, some manufacturers, they have dual memory card slots, and they might both be the same. They might both be SD. Sometimes it's two different types. So it's just something to bear in mind. And don't automatically assume that, you know, you've got a selection of SD cards you're upgrading to a new camera. Don't automatically assume that it's going to take the cards that you've got. Now, I just thought it might be useful to do a little quick comparison between DSLR and mirrorless cameras, because I think a lot of people at the moment are considering, either they're thinking about wanting to buy a new camera, or maybe their first camera, or they're thinking about switching from one to the other. So I'm just going to quick comparison. So DSLRs generally are less expensive, and that's because, you know, they've got they're not so expensive to create because you don't have the electronic viewfinder, for example, which tends to be a more expensive component. However, mirrorless cameras are the focus for technological development at the moment. It's really where the manufacturers are putting their efforts and developing. So if it's important to you to get something that you might think, you know, is more cutting edge, or is perhaps arguably more future-proof, then perhaps you should look at a mirrorless camera. DSLR cameras, however, have been around for longer, and it means that there are a huge number of lenses and accessories available. And that's particularly great in the secondhand market, because, you know, as well as there being lots of DSLRs available secondhand for great prices, there are lots of lenses and accessories to go with it. And it may mean that, you know, if you go for an SLR, you can get that really long lens that you want for your wildlife photography, that really wide lens that you want. And if you went for a mirrorless camera, it would be too expensive. As I mentioned, mirrorless cameras are smaller and lighter than DSLRs, but the lenses may be a similar weight. Now, the fact that you can shift the lens slightly closer to the sensor can make a little bit of difference. But the important thing is to think about the sensor size, because if you are looking at the difference between, say, an APS-C format DSLR and a full frame mirrorless camera, overall the system is likely to be heavier on the mirrorless side, because you've gone for a bigger sensor. And, you know, when you have a bag of DSLR lenses and a bag of mirrorless lenses for the same size sensor, there's not going to be a huge difference in their weight. DSLRs have an optical viewfinder, which gives a very natural view, and a lot of people really like that. They like the fact that, you know, when you look in the viewfinder, it looks very similar to just looking with the naked eye. Whereas electronic viewfinders, I mean, they have improved a heck of a lot, but you can still usually tell that you're looking at a digital screen, but what you see is what you get. So you're looking at the image as it will be captured, or you can do that. Sometimes you can turn it off to get that kind of, to get what they call a natural view, a bit more like a DSLR, but I think the main point of an electrical viewfinder really is to get the impact or see the impact of the camera's exposure settings and all the other settings. So with an electronic viewfinder, if the image is going to be underexposed, you will see a dark image. If you have accidentally set it to black and white mode, or you've forgotten that you set it to black and white, you will see a black and white image. And if the white balance is way off, you will always see that. So you can adjust and you can use the image in the viewfinder to help determine your camera settings. Now, DSLRs, maybe you can get the best of both worlds, because as I said before, they can mimic a mirrorless camera in live view mode. However, with a mirrorless camera, you get seamless switching between the viewfinder and the screen when you're composing images. If you're using a DSLR, if you compose in the viewfinder, you're using all the sort of like viewfinder centric autofocus system and everything. When you switch on the live view system, you then, there's a bit of a clunk, and then you're looking at the screen, and you've got a different autofocus system, different white balance, all that sort of stuff. So it's just a little bit of a difference. Whereas with mirrorless cameras, because they've got a sensor usually as well, you can look at the screen, you put your camera to your eye to look in the viewfinder, and you see the image there, you take it away, and it's just switching between, and you get exactly the same experience regardless of how you're composing your image. DSLRs have been used by pro photographers for years, and they are tried and tested. So, you can do all sorts of types of photography with them. There are plenty of photographers who can give you information about how to use them. They are highly regarded. However, mirrorless cameras these days, as mentioned, they're focused for technological development. They are, particularly when it comes to autofocus, there's all sorts of developments going on in autofocus. They generally cover a wider area of the frame with autofocus points. So, if you like to focus towards the edge, you can do that without having to do the focus and recompose technique. And they have got some excellent tracking systems, and also subject detection is becoming a really important feature, or a really popular feature. You may have heard of eye autofocus and eye detection. We're starting to see vehicle detection, and it can be really useful to be able to focus on a subject's eyes or whatever's important in the frame without having to think about it too much. The camera detects the eye, and you can take the shot knowing that it's got it sharp, and you only have to think about the composition and also the exposure. Just make sure that the image looks how you want it to look, but the camera takes care of the focusing. Okay, so I've whittled quite quickly through all of that, but do we have any questions? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Someone has asked me whether compact cameras shoot RAW files. Yes, not all. Well, actually, I think most of them can these days. Maybe not the point and shoots, but generally, yes. Do bridge cameras do video? Yes, they do. They, in the same way compact cameras do as well, and SLRs do, and mirrorless cameras do. So, yeah, they do. Okay, that's a good point. Someone has asked me, what is the difference between phase and contrast detection? And I think I actually did forget to explain that. So thank you for asking. So with contrast detection, the camera is looking to create the image with the strongest contrast at the focus point. And it starts adjusting the lens, but it doesn't actually know which way to go. So if it adjusts and it sees that the contrast is getting weaker, it will go back and it starts adjusting it. But then it doesn't know when it's reached the point of highest contrast. So it tends to go a bit beyond it and then come back and then settle on the point of highest contrast, and that then the lens is focused. Now I'm doing contrast detection a little bit of a disservice because that's kind of like a really slowed down version, but the first mirrorless cameras that came out that used contrast detection, you did notice quite a bit of indecision and backwards and forwards movement, a bit of hunting. But they have got a lot better. With phase detection, it basically, the camera, because it uses 2 points, the camera actually knows which direction to move the lens to focus and also how far. So it tends to be faster and more decisive. Both are accurate, but phase detection tends to be faster. And then you get hybrid systems which use a blend of the two. Okay, we have someone says she's got a Sony A7 Mark III that she can't get on with. She's thinking of moving to OMD with Micro Four Thirds. Is it lower quality? Well, in all honesty, it will be slightly in some respects, but I'm just trying to think, you know, that the resolution is slightly lower and the sensor is quite a bit lower. The A7 Mark III is a full frame camera with 24 million pixels. So I think you will see some change. But the thing is, the most dramatic difference is going to be at high sensitivity settings. And you might see noise creeping into the images a little bit earlier in Olympus cameras when you push the sensitivity up, the ISO up. But, you know, it depends what you're shooting. And the thing is, if you're not getting on with your camera and not enjoying it, whereas with an Olympus camera, you really love it, then you should go for the OMD. You should go for that camera. And I wouldn't worry too much, because there are plenty of people, you know, professional photographers who use Olympus cameras, and it just depends on what you're shooting. You know, there are plenty of pro wildlife photographers who use OMD or Olympus. Someone is asking me, how good or reliable is the second-hand market for cameras? I think it's actually generally very good. I mean, this webinar is sponsored by MPB, and it is a marketplace for buying and selling second-hand equipment. And I have used them several times, both to sell my own camera and to buy others. And the thing is that by having that platform, you're taking out the person who doesn't really know much about a camera selling it, saying it's fine, because it goes and it gets checked by an expert, and they will turn around and say to the person, actually, you know what, this is in worse condition than you said, so we're going to give you slightly less money. But I know plenty of people as well who've done the opposite. They think, oh, well, this camera's in good condition, and when they've sent it in, MPB has said, no, this is in excellent condition, so we're going to give you more money. So you've got that kind of that fallback, but also they give you a guarantee. So I would say that the second-hand market is very good, and it's certainly worth exploring for both, you know, for any type of camera, to be honest. And I know in conversations I've had with MPB, when a new camera comes out, if you wait about 3 months, it starts to appear on their books, because, you know, some people, they get very excited about the camera, they go and buy it, and they don't really get on with it for whatever reason. You know, I know quite a few people, for example, have invested in high resolution cameras, and they love the detail they get. But when they've been shooting, say, later at night, they don't like the noise, or they've realized that they're filling up their memory cards. But if you're happy with that, then that's the perfect camera. It's about matching the camera specifications to what you want. Okay, so I think we have got to the end of the questions. So thanks everybody for coming along tonight. I hope you found that useful. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Bye-bye.